The first thing the lawyer said was, "You've been removed from the will." I didn't hear anything after that. Not the hum of the air conditioner. Not the scrape of his pen against the legal pad. Not even my own breathing. Just those words echoing like a gunshot in a room that had been quiet for too long. Removed. From the will. I'm 61 years old. I raised 2 children, buried 1 husband, and spent 3 decades building a life I thought was solid. And yet in that single sentence, everything I believed about my family cracked. I remember gripping the arms of the chair to keep myself upright. My palms were slick with sweat, my mouth dry. The lawyer cleared his throat and started explaining, but his voice blurred into a distant murmur, like someone talking underwater. "This must be a mistake," I finally said. "I'm his wife." Correction, I thought bitterly. I was his wife. My husband, Richard Hale, had died 6 weeks earlier from what the doctors called a sudden cardiac event. No warning, no prolonged illness. One moment he was complaining about the neighbor's dog barking at midnight, the next he was gone. 58 years old. Fit. Active. Still running his construction consulting company like it was a second heartbeat. And now I was being told that the man I shared a bed with for 27 years had rewritten his will and cut me out. The lawyer slid a document across the desk. "The will was updated 18 months ago," he said carefully. "Your name appears only once." I looked down. Excluded. That was the word. Instead, everything went to my stepdaughter, Melissa. 35 years old, blonde, smiling, always polite in that sharp, practiced way that never quite reached her eyes. A woman who had called me Susan instead of Mom for 15 years and never once invited me to sit at the front table during holidays. The house, the lake property, the investment accounts, even the company shares, all of it. "I don't understand," I whispered. "Richard wouldn't do this without telling me." The lawyer hesitated, and in that hesitation I felt something ugly begin to crawl up my spine. "He did leave a letter," he said. "Not for you, for Melissa." I laughed then. A short, broken sound that startled even me. "So I'm not even worth a goodbye." He didn't answer. When I walked out of that office, the afternoon sun felt offensive. Too bright, too normal. People were laughing on the sidewalk, carrying grocery bags, living lives untouched by betrayal. I sat in my car for almost an hour, staring at the steering wheel, replaying every moment of the last 2 years. Every late night, Richard said he was working. Every time Melissa suddenly appeared at our house with documents for him to sign. Every Thanksgiving dinner where she sat beside him, whispering while I refilled glasses and pretended not to notice. Had it been happening right in front of me, by the time I drove home, my hands were shaking. The house was silent. Too silent. Half of it no longer belonged to me, apparently. I wandered into the living room and stared at the photographs on the mantel. Christmas? A wedding? Richard with his arm around Melissa, smiling proudly. Me standing just a step away, smiling too unaware I was already being erased. That night, I didn't cry. I did something far more dangerous. I started thinking. 18 months ago, that was the timeline. I pulled out my old planner, the one I never threw away, flipped back page by page, and there it was circled in blue ink. Melissa staying with us for a while. That was when Richard's behavior changed. That was when the secrecy began. That was when I stopped being a partner and became background noise. I went to bed around 2 a.m, but I didn't sleep. My mind kept circling one question that burned hotter the longer I stayed awake. If Richard had deliberately cut me out, why? And more importantly, who had convinced him to do it? The first lie revealed itself at breakfast. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the coffee maker like it might suddenly confess something. Richard had always been obsessive about routine. Same brand of beans, same mug, same time every morning, and yet in the months before his death, he'd stopped drinking coffee at home altogether. "I grab it at the office," he'd said casually. I believed him, because wives believe their husbands until belief becomes a habit instead of a choice. I opened his desk drawer for the first time since the funeral. I told myself I was just looking for warranty papers. That's the lie we tell ourselves before the truth. Inside, beneath neatly stacked folders, was a second phone. Burner, prepaid, cheap. My heart pounded as I turned it on. No lock. That should have scared me more than it did. The messages weren't romantic. Not at first glance. They were logistical, calculated, cold. "Dad, you can't tell her yet. Timing matters. She doesn't need to know everything. Her. Me." I sat down hard in the chair, my knees suddenly weak. The dates matched. 18 months ago. Right when Melissa moved in, claiming her apartment was being renovated. Right when she started having private business conversations with her father behind closed doors. I scrolled further. There were messages about the company, about restructuring, about how Susan would only complicate things. I read that line 3 times. Complicate. As if I were an obstacle, a liability, a problem to manage. Then I found the email drafts. Not sent, saved. Richard's words typed and erased again and again. Doubt, guilt, hesitation. He'd rewritten the same paragraph multiple times. "I know this will hurt her. She's been good to me, but Melissa says this is the only way. Melissa says. I felt something snap inside my chest. Not pain, clarity. This wasn't a sudden decision. It was a campaign. A slow erosion, whispered doubts over months, manufactured concerns, stories told carefully enough to sound like protection, not manipulation. I wasn't betrayed once. I was dismantled piece by piece. By noon, I was in my car driving toward Melissa's office. She worked as an operations manager at a real estate development firm, a position she landed shortly after moving in with us. Another coincidence I had never questioned. I didn't plan to confront her. Not yet. Revenge is not born in confrontation. It's born in patience. I parked across the street and watched her through the glass walls. Confident, laughing, in control. A woman who believed she had already won. That was when my phone rang. Unknown number, I answered. Susan, the voice said smoothly. We need to talk. It was Melissa. I didn't respond. I know you met with the lawyer, she continued. I think it's best if we clear the air. Clear the air. The same phrase Richard used whenever he wanted to bury something. I'm very busy, I said, calmly, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. She laughed softly. I doubt that. There it was. The dismissal. The certainty. I'll come by the house tonight, she said. We can discuss your transition. My transition. As if I were a position being phased out. Fine, I replied. What? She? When I hung up, my reflection in the rearview mirror startled me. I didn't look like a grieving widow. I looked like a woman who had just been underestimated for the last time. That afternoon, I called a different lawyer, a forensic accountant, and an old friend. Richard never liked someone who once told me, if you ever need the truth, I know where to dig. By the time the sun began to set, my living room was spotless. Tea was ready. Documents were laid out neatly. Melissa arrived at 7 on the dot, dressed in white, like she was attending a funeral that wasn't hers. She smiled when she saw me. That was her mistake, because as she sat down across from me, confident and relaxed, she had no idea that everything she thought she owned was already slipping through her fingers, and I was about to begin taking it back. If you're ready to see how betrayal turns into justice, stay with me. Like this story, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe, because what comes next is where karma finally starts keeping score. Melissa didn't waste time with sympathy. She wrapped both hands around her teacup like she owned the room, crossed her legs, and looked at me the way people look at furniture. They're deciding whether to keep or discard. I know this is hard for you, she said, but Dad made his choice. I studied her face, the perfect makeup, the controlled posture, not a flicker of grief for the man she supposedly loved so deeply. Only calculation. You moved in 18 months ago, I said quietly. That's when everything changed. Her smile didn't falter. Dad needed help. You were tired. Overwhelmed. Overwhelmed. Another word that had followed me around like a stain. He rewrote his will shortly after that, I continued. Did you help him with that too? She leaned back unfazed. He asked for my advice. I gave it. You convinced him I was a liability. I helped him see reality. There it was. No denial, no shame. You were emotional, she said. Older. Not involved in the company. Dad needed someone who understood business. I was his wife. She shrugged. Marriage doesn't make you competent. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I didn't let it show. Rage clouds judgment, and I needed my mind razor sharp. So this is it, I said. You take everything, and I'm supposed to disappear. Melissa's eyes softened just slightly. Not with kindness, with condescension. I'll make sure you're comfortable, she said. A monthly allowance, the guest room, until you figure out your next step. My next step. In my own house. I nodded slowly. You're very generous. She smiled satisfied. I try to be fair. Fair? After she left, I locked the door and stood in the silence for a long time. Then I walked into Richard's office and closed it behind me. That was where the second truth revealed itself. Inside the bottom drawer beneath old contracts, I found a manila envelope labeled in Richard's handwriting. Personal. Inside were bank statements, wire transfers, large ones, regular ones, all sent to Melissa. Over 18 months, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Company funds, not inheritance. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. I sat at his desk and laid everything out in chronological order. The transfers lined up with Melissa's career growth, her promotions, her new car, her designer wardrobe. She hadn't just manipulated the will. She had been bleeding him dry while he was alive, and Richard, blind with guilt or fear or love, had let her. My phone buzzed. A text from the forensic accountant I'd contacted earlier. I've reviewed the preliminary documents you sent. There are serious irregularities. This looks like embezzlement. I closed my eyes. Good. That night, I slept better than I had since Richard died. Not because I felt peace, but because I finally understood the game. And once you understand the rules, you can change the outcome. The next morning, I went to the company. Richard's company. Melissa wasn't expecting that. She stood up abruptly when she saw me walk into the conference room. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Susan, this isn't necessary, she said tirelessly. I disagree, I replied. I'm Richard's surviving spouse, and until probate is complete, I still have legal standing. That part was true, and she knew it. I laid the documents on the table. Bank statements, transfer records, dates circled in red. One of the board members frowned. What is this? Evidence, I said calmly, of unauthorized financial activity. Melissa's face went pale. These were approved, she snapped. Your father did not have the authority to approve personal transfers from company accounts, I interrupted. And if you insist he did, I suggest you prepare to explain that to a judge. Silence fell like a blade. I watched the realization spread across her face. She had assumed I was weak, distracted by grief, too old to fight back. She had forgotten one thing. I raised 2 children. I survived a marriage, and I had nothing left to lose. As the board members began asking questions, voices overlapping, Melissa turned to me with eyes full of fury. This isn't over, she hissed. I met her gaze steadily. No, I said. It's just beginning. And for the first time since Richard died, I felt something stir that wasn't grief. It was purpose. The first subpoena arrived 3 days later. Melissa called me the moment she received it. You did this, she said, her voice shaking with rage. You're trying to destroy me. I held the phone away from my ear and waited for her to finish screaming. When she finally stopped to breathe, I spoke. No, I said. You destroyed yourself. She hung up. That afternoon, my attorney confirmed what I already suspected. The company board had launched a full internal audit. Once that started, everything unraveled quickly. The wire transfers, the falsified approvals, the conveniently missing documentation. Melissa hadn't just taken money. She had forged signatures, including Richard's. The thought made my stomach twist. Even in death, she had used him. But karma, I was learning, has a long memory. By the end of the week, Melissa was placed on administrative leave. By the end of the month, she was terminated. Quietly, publicly, thoroughly. And then came the lawsuit. The company sued her for fraud. The bank flagged her accounts. Her assets were frozen pending investigation. The woman who had planned my erasure was suddenly fighting for her own survival. She showed up at the house unannounced one evening, eyes red, composure gone. You can't do this, she said, standing in my doorway. I'll lose everything. I studied her, really looked at her. This was the daughter who had sat at my Thanksgiving table, the woman who had hugged me at Christmas, the person who had looked me in the eye and decided my life was expendable. You already took everything, I said quietly. This is just balance. Her voice broke. He promised me, Dad promised me the company, and he promised me a marriage, I replied. Funny how promises work. She laughed bitterly. You think you've won? I shook my head. No, I think you haven't even realized what you've lost. She left without another word. 2 weeks later, probate court began reviewing the will. That was when the third truth surfaced. Richard's will, the one Melissa had so carefully orchestrated, had a clause she didn't know about. If the primary beneficiary was found guilty of financial crimes against the estate or the company, the inheritance would be void. Redistributed. To me, I sat in the courtroom, hands folded in my lap, as the judge read the findings. Melissa sat across the room, pale, her jaw clenched so tightly I thought her teeth might crack. Her lawyer whispered urgently. She didn't respond. When the judge announced the suspension of her inheritance pending the outcome of the criminal investigation, something inside her finally broke. She turned and looked at me, not with hatred, with fear, and in that moment I understood the true shape of revenge. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent. It was watching someone realize they had built their future on a lie, and there was nothing left to stand on. But the story wasn't over yet, because as the court recessed and people began to file out, my lawyer leaned toward me and whispered something that made my blood run cold. There's another document, he said. One Richard signed just weeks before his death. I looked up sharply. What kind of document? He hesitated. A trust, and it named someone unexpected. My heart began to race, because if Richard had one last secret, it might change everything. I didn't sleep that night. The word trust echoed in my head like a ticking clock. Richard had never mentioned a trust, not once. We talked about retirement accounts, about downsizing someday, about traveling after he sold his shares. But a trust created weeks before his death. By morning, my nerves felt stretched thin, like wire pulled too tight. My lawyer met me at his office just after 9. He didn't offer coffee. That alone told me this wasn't going to be easy. The trust is real, he said, sliding a thick folder across the desk. Irrevocable, signed and notarized. I opened it slowly, my hands trembling, despite my effort to stay composed. The beneficiary name hit me like a slap. Not Melissa. Not me. It was Eleanor Hale, Richard's mother, my former mother-in-law, 83 years old, living in assisted care in Arizona, a woman who had never forgiven me for marrying her son, who once told me to my face that I was temporary. She's still alive, I asked quietly. Yes, my lawyer said. And according to this, Richard transferred a significant portion of his remaining personal assets into the trust, enough to fund her care for the rest of her life, with one condition. I looked up. What condition? He hesitated. The trustee is Melissa. The room tilted. So even after everything I whispered, he still put her in control. Yes, he said gently, but there's more. He flipped to another page. If the trustee is found to have acted in bad faith, committed fraud, or engaged in criminal activity connected to the estate, control of the trust automatically transfers. To whom? He met my eyes. To you. I sat back stunned. Richard hadn't been completely blind. He had known something was wrong. Enough to build a contingency, enough to protect his mother, enough to leave a door open for me. But he still hadn't warned me. He suspected, I said slowly, but he didn't stop her. Fear does strange things to people, my lawyer replied. On my drive home, my phone rang. Arizona number. I almost didn't answer. This is Susan, I said cautiously. A sharp inhale on the other end, then a voice brittle with age and resentment. So Eleanor said, I hear you're trying to ruin my granddaughter. Granddaughter? Not stepdaughter, never stepdaughter. I'm uncovering the truth, I replied evenly. You always were dramatic, she snapped. Melissa told me everything. You're confused, emotional, grasping. I gripped the steering wheel. She's under criminal investigation, I said. Did she mention that? Silence. Then quieter, she said you were manipulating the situation. Of course she did. Eleanor, I said, choosing my words carefully. I have documents. Proof. If Melissa goes down, the trust transfers to me. Her breath caught. She wouldn't lie to me, Eleanor said, but her voice wavered. She forged Richard's signature, I replied. Multiple times. Another pause. I need to think, she muttered, then hung up. That evening, Melissa showed up again. She looked different this time. Smaller. The confidence stripped away, replaced with desperation. You talked to my grandmother, she accused. Yes, I said calmly. You're poisoning her against me. You did that yourself. She stepped closer. You think this ends with money? I looked at her steadily. No, this ends with accountability. Her eyes flashed. You're not as innocent as you pretend. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. What does that mean? She smiled thinly. You think Dad never talked to me about you? About your past. My pulse quickened. Say what you mean. But she just turned and left her words hanging in the air like a threat. And for the first time, I wondered what secrets Richard might have shared and how far Melissa was willing to go to protect herself. Melissa didn't wait long to strike back. 3 days later, I got a call from my attorney before I even finished breakfast. She's filed a motion, he said, claiming you exerted undue influence over Richard in the last years of his life. I laughed once, sharp, humorless. On what basis? She alleges cognitive decline, emotional manipulation, isolation. My stomach tightened. She's trying to paint me as abusive. Yes, he said quietly. And she has witnesses. Witnesses. People who had smiled at me at dinner parties, who had accepted my hospitality, who had listened to Melissa's version of reality long before Richard died. By noon, the narrative had shifted. I was no longer the grieving widow. I was the unstable wife, the resentful stepmother, the woman who couldn't accept being excluded. Online articles appeared. Subtle at first. Dispute over Hale estate continues. Then, sharper. Family conflict raises questions about late executives' final years. Melissa had gone public. That night, I received an email from the assisted care facility. Eleanor had requested no further contact with me. Melissa had gotten to her. I sat alone in the living room, the house feeling larger and emptier than ever. For the first time since this began, doubt crept in. What if I pushed too far? What if she really did manage to twist this into something ugly? Then my phone buzzed. A message from someone I hadn't heard from in years. Daniel Price, Richard's former business partner. I think we need to talk, the message read. There are things you don't know. We met the next morning at a quiet diner off the highway. Daniel looked older, tired, guilt etched into every line of his face. I warned Richard, he said, after we sat down, about Melissa. My chest tightened. About what? She was siphoning money before she ever moved in with you, he said. Using shell accounts, pressuring him, threatening to expose something. Expose what? Daniel hesitated, then leaned closer. You. I stared at him. Me. She told Richard you'd ruin him if he didn't comply. That you had secrets. That if he crossed her, you'd take everything in a divorce. My breath caught. She lied, I whispered. I know, Daniel said. But Richard was scared. Not of you, of losing control. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Melissa hadn't just manipulated him. She had weaponized me. There's more, Daniel said. Before Richard died, he asked me to hold on to something. He slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a flash drive. He said if anything happened to him, you'd know what to do. My fingers closed around it. What's on it? I asked. Daniel met my eyes. Proof, not just against Melissa, against everyone who helped her. I felt the familiar spark ignite again. Purpose, resolve. As I stood to leave, my phone buzzed with a new message. From Melissa. You should stop digging, it read. Some truths are better buried. I slipped the phone into my purse and smiled faintly. She was right about one thing. The truth was buried, but I was very good at digging. And in the next chapter of this story, she was going to learn exactly how deep her own grave was. I waited until night to plug in the flash drive, not because I was afraid of what I'd find, but because some truths deserve darkness, silence, space to breathe before they tear something open inside you. The first file was a folder labeled simply Insurance. Inside were scanned documents, emails, and voice recordings. My heart began to pound. Richard had increased his life insurance policy twice in the last 2 years. Large increases. Both changes initiated after meetings with Melissa. And the beneficiary changes, they were temporary. Rotating, short-term, almost experimental. I clicked on an audio file. Richard's voice filled the room, strained and exhausted. She keeps saying Susan will leave me if I don't protect her future, that I'll lose everything. She says I owe her, that I failed her mother. Another recording. I don't trust her anymore, but if I confront her, she'll destroy us all. I need time. I pressed my hand to my mouth. He had known. He had been trapped. The final recording was dated 3 days before his death. If anything happens to me, it won't be natural. The words settled into my bones like ice. I sat there for a long time after the recording ended, staring at the black screen. Grief came in a new form then. Not the grief of loss, but the grief of realizing how alone he had been at the end, and how close I had been to sharing his fate. The next morning, I didn't call my lawyer. I called the police, not the local station, the financial crimes unit in the state capital. When I told them I had evidence suggesting coercion fraud and possible insurance manipulation preceding a suspicious death, the tone of the conversation changed immediately. By noon, 2 detectives were sitting in my living room. I played them the recordings, showed them the documents, explained the timeline. They didn't interrupt. When it was over, one of them closed his notebook slowly. "We're reopening the death investigation," he said. I exhaled for the first time in weeks. That afternoon, Melissa's world began to collapse. Her attorney called mine, urgent, panicked. The company froze additional accounts. Eleanor's trust was placed under emergency review. Melissa was ordered to surrender financial records, personal devices, and travel history. And then came the call I never expected. Eleanor. Her voice was thinner than I remembered, weaker. "They took my phone," she said quietly. "The police." I didn't speak. They asked me questions about Melissa, she continued. About Richard. About money. A pause. I think I was wrong about you." The words didn't bring satisfaction, only sadness. "She used me," Eleanor whispered. "Just like she used him." "Yes," I said softly. "She did." That night, Melissa was arrested. Not for Richard's death. Not yet. For financial fraud, identity forgery, and obstruction. As the news broke, her name splashed across screens with words like betrayal, manipulation, and hidden truth. She was denied bail. I watched the footage once, just once. She looked smaller behind the glass. No makeup, no control. Just a woman finally facing the consequences of her own design. But the story wasn't finished, because the autopsy report came back 2 weeks later, and what it revealed would change everything. The call came at dawn. I recognized the number immediately. "This is Detective Morales," the voice said. "We need you to come in." I dressed without thinking. My hands moved on instinct, my mind racing ahead of my body. In the interview room, the air felt heavy. "We re-examined your husband's toxicology," Morales said carefully. "Based on new parameters." My heart pounded. "There were trace compounds present," he continued. "At levels too low to raise flags initially, but consistent with long-term exposure." I closed my eyes. "Poison? Not enough to kill quickly, enough to weaken. To stress the heart," Morales said, "to make a cardiac event more likely." I felt something inside me harden. "Melissa," I asked. He nodded. "We found purchase records, research searches, messages." The room spun. "She didn't kill him directly," he said, "but she accelerated an outcome she anticipated. That qualifies as homicide." I thought of the recordings, Richard's fear, his exhaustion. She hadn't just wanted him dead, she had needed him gone. Melissa was charged with second-degree murder the following week. The courtroom was silent when the charges were read. Eleanor didn't attend. She was hospitalized that morning, the weight of the truth finally crushing what little strength she had left. Melissa didn't look at me. Not once. The trial lasted months. Experts testified about manipulation, toxic family dynamics, favoritism, and financial desperation, about how greed corrodes loyalty, about how inheritance can turn love into leverage. The jury listened, and when the verdict came back guilty, I felt nothing at first. No triumph, no joy, only release. Melissa was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 20 years. She screamed as they took her away. I didn't flinch. 6 months later, I sold the house. I moved to a smaller place near the ocean. White walls, open air, a space that belonged only to me. The trust transferred to my control. Eleanor passed peacefully not long after. I ensured her care until the end. Not because she deserved it, but because I refused to become what Melissa was. Sometimes people ask me if I regret pursuing the truth, if revenge consumed me. It didn't. Justice healed me. And if you're listening to this story and you've ever felt erased, manipulated, or betrayed by the people closest to you, remember this. Truth has weight, and karma never forgets who planted the seed. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support keeps these voices alive. I thought the worst was behind me. That was my mistake. 3 weeks after Melissa's conviction, I received a letter postmarked from the state prison. No return address, just my name written carefully, deliberately. I didn't open it right away. There's a certain instinct you develop after betrayal. A quiet voice that says not everything dangerous announces itself loudly. Some things arrive politely sealed in white envelopes. I opened it that night. Susan, you think you won. That was the first line. My stomach tightened, but I kept reading. Dad wasn't the only one with secrets, and I wasn't the only one who kept records. If you care about your reputation, your freedom, or the way history remembers you, you'll come see me. Melissa. The letter slipped from my fingers onto the kitchen table. She was threatening me, not emotionally, strategically. I called my attorney the next morning. He advised against any contact. The prosecutor said the same, but neither of them knew what Melissa knew, or claimed to know. Because that night, as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, fragments of memory began resurfacing. Old arguments, long-buried compromises, decisions I made years ago telling myself they were necessary. Richard's company, the early years. A subcontractor who fell from scaffolding, a settlement paid quietly, no lawsuit, no headlines. I had handled the paperwork. At the time, it felt like protecting my family. Now it felt like a loaded gun pointed backward through time. I requested a supervised visit. The prison smelled like disinfectant and despair. Melissa sat behind the glass dressed in gray, her hair pulled back tightly. She looked thinner, sharper. You came, she said, smiling. I want to know what you think you have, I replied. She tilted her head. Proof that you're not as clean as everyone thinks. She slid papers through the slot. Copies, old emails, settlement drafts. My name on them. You helped bury an accident, she said softly. You convinced Dad to pay instead of report. He was injured, not killed, I snapped. And he agreed to the settlement. But it violated reporting laws, she said. And if it came out now with your name attached... She let the implication hang. You'd drag me down with you, I said. She smiled. I'm already down. I stared at her, realizing something chilling. This wasn't leverage for freedom. This was revenge. You won't ruin me, I said quietly. You won't rewrite the truth. You already did, she replied. I just kept the receipts. I left the prison shaking. That night, I dug through my own records, every file, every archive, and there it was. The subcontractor had died 2 years later. Not from the fall, but the settlement paperwork included a clause that could be interpreted as coercive. Melissa didn't have enough to destroy me, but she had enough to stain me. I made a decision. The next morning, I walked into the district attorney's office, and I told them everything. Confession is not weakness. It's control. I sat across from the district attorney and laid it all out. The settlement, the paperwork, the pressure I'd applied, the fear I'd felt at the time. I made choices to protect my family, I said. And I understand if those choices carry consequences. They reviewed everything for weeks. In the end, the conclusion was simple. No criminal charges. Statute of limitations. But something else happened. Melissa lost her last weapon. When the prosecutor informed her that I had voluntarily disclosed the information she was threatening to use, she reportedly screamed until her voice gave out. The appeal she had planned quietly disappeared, and the letter stopped. I thought that would be the end. It wasn't, because the media found out, not about the settlement, not in detail, but about my cooperation, my transparency, my refusal to hide. The narrative shifted. I wasn't the erased wife anymore. I was the woman who survived betrayal, exposed manipulation, and stood accountable even when she didn't have to. Invitations started arriving. Podcasts, panels, support groups for women navigating toxic family dynamics and inheritance battles. I said no to most of them, but I said yes to one. A small conference for women over 50 who had been excluded, manipulated, or erased by family or workplace betrayal. I stood on that stage, hands shaking slightly, and told my story. Not as revenge, as warning, as truth. Afterward, a woman approached me. Gray hair, steady eyes. My daughter is doing what yours did, she whispered, and I thought I was imagining it. I took her hands. You're not. That night, sitting alone in my oceanside apartment, I realized something profound. Revenge had never been my destination. Reclamation was. Melissa tried to destroy me by erasing my worth. Instead, she forced me to define it myself. And in doing so, I became something she never was. Free. But as I watched the waves crash against the shore, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Just 4 words. You missed something important. And suddenly I knew. The story wasn't over yet. You missed something important. Those 4 words followed me for days. I didn't respond. I didn't even save the number. But I couldn't stop replaying every step of the last 2 years, searching for loose threads. Melissa was in prison, her appeals were gone, the estate was settled, the company had stabilized under new leadership. I had moved on, or so I thought. Yet that message carried certainty. Not a bluff, not desperation, certainty. I hired a private investigator. Quietly. A woman in her late 50s who had spent 20 years uncovering financial fraud for insurance companies. I trusted her immediately. She didn't romanticize justice. She respected facts. 2 weeks later, she came to my apartment with a thin folder and a look that told me my life was about to shift again. Melissa didn't act alone, she said. I exhaled slowly. I know. No, she corrected. I don't mean emotionally, I mean structurally. She laid out the documents. A shell consulting firm, offshore accounts, payments routed through a charity foundation, and one familiar name, Daniel Price, Richard's former business partner, the man who had given me the flash drive, the man who had warned me. He helped her, the investigator said. At first indirectly, later intentionally. My chest tightened. Why would he expose her then? I asked. Because she cut him out, she replied. He thought aligning with you would save him. Everything snapped into place with brutal clarity. Daniel hadn't acted out of loyalty. He acted out of fear. The flash drive had been curated, enough to bury Melissa, not enough to expose him. And that message, it came from him. I met Daniel one last time. Same diner, same booth. You should have disappeared quietly, he said, eyes darting. I almost did, I replied. You miscalculated. He leaned forward. You don't understand how deep this goes. I understand enough, I said, sliding copies of the financial transfers across the table, the charity, the kickbacks, the falsified invoices. His face drained of color. You helped create the monster, I continued. And then you tried to outrun her. He didn't deny it. I didn't threaten him. I didn't need to. I turned the evidence over to federal investigators that afternoon. 6 months later, Daniel Price was indicted for conspiracy, wire fraud, and obstruction. He pled guilty. No dramatic arrest, no cameras, just a quiet fall. And that was the most fitting ending of all. 1 year later, I stood barefoot on my balcony, watching the ocean breathe in and out like a living thing. The trials were over. The noise had faded. For the first time in decades, my life felt honest. Melissa remained in prison. Daniel was serving his sentence. The company was thriving under ethical leadership, and I had something I never expected to reclaim. Peace. Not because I forgot what happened, but because I stopped carrying shame that never belonged to me. People still ask me if I hate her. The answer is no. Hatred keeps you tethered. I learned something far more powerful. Indifference. I volunteer now. I mentor women navigating inheritance disputes, workplace betrayal, toxic family dynamics. I teach them how to document, how to protect themselves, how to trust facts over fear. I celebrate holidays differently. Smaller tables, chosen family. Conversations that don't require pretending. Sometimes late at night, I think about the woman I was before all this began. The one who believed loyalty was always reciprocated, who mistook silence for safety. I don't judge her. She loved deeply. But this version of me, she survives wisely. If you're listening to this story and you recognize yourself in it, let me leave you with this. Betrayal does not mean you were weak. It means someone underestimated your strength. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, wait, watch, act. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your voice matters here. Your story matters. And sometimes telling it is the first act of revenge.